Just before you finish giving your evidence, if I could maybe ask a couple of questions related to your international experience. You've obviously looked at what's happening elsewhere. And in terms of that gender differential, is there a model out there at the moment that is seen to be effective in dealing with that? You've referenced, from the point of view of speed in establishing a fund, that New Zealand is a good example of that, but it's a poor example in terms of the gender differential. And of course, look, the important thing is, and we all know this, that it's important to get this right. So whether it takes 18 months or 48 months to get it up and running, this is something that's going to be in place for generations to come, and we need to make sure that we get it right. Now, one of the things that members here have raised in previous meetings that we've had is the issue of fees. Now, there is a cap set on the fees under the auto-enrolment at 0.5% of the overall fund. If we go back to an article that Charlie Weston published in the Irish Independent, where the headline was that 6 out of 10 euro of pension fund pots is consumed by charges. And I know that led to the bill that Jed Nash has had passed at second stage here in the House regarding the transparency in relation to charges. And this is something that the committee is genuinely concerned about, is that we don't want to be seeing people working, investing money in a pension pot which is actually only being used to fund the fees and the operation of that fund, rather than actually delivering a long-term pension. So what are the models out there that can effectively deliver what we want to see happen without excessive charges being placed on the customer?
Sure. Just first to comment that the initial Stroman proposal did have that cap in there in terms of fees, but that cap is not in the AE bill. So under a state-run model, there isn't actually a cap in terms of what the member can be charged. And I think if you were to look at typical existing occupational pension schemes, the larger ones, as auto-enrolment would be, that 50 basis fee would be in or around what schemes are currently being charged. I might ask Oisin just maybe to comment on the international experience.
Yeah, so we would be we think the 50 bips is a good level, and a good idea, and we'd be supportive of that. And as Declan said, it does fit. Like if we look at our own large schemes, they come in with an average charge under the 50 bips, and that feels like the right level for a scheme like this. If you look internationally, the UK have a 75 bip, 70.75% charge limit in the UK. Although providers, competition has actually driven that lower, and the actual experience charge in the UK is below that 0.75%. And if you look at New Zealand, it was a 1% max charge. So we think the 0.5% that was in the original Strawman is, at the right level, and it compares very favourably internationally. And we wouldn't have a concern about that if we were going with the Strawman and auto-enrolment was being delivered through the private market. We wouldn't have a problem with the 0.5%, and we think that serves members really well.
Yeah, but I would say, if effectively, I think if the state is taking on the cost of the full build of a full end-to-end pension system, members paying 50 bips or 0.5% per annum on that, it will take an awful long time for that to recover the cost of the build. It is definitely a more expensive build for the state taking on the complete end-to-end build. And I think it is important that members don't pick up that cost if that is the way that things go.
If we look at a typical, say auto-enrolment is live, and if we look at an average worker in the population contributing in the first year, that charge, that 0.5% is €4.75, in terms of per year. Now it will obviously build up as their fund builds up, but that's the level of charges you're talking about. So Nest in the UK has so far cost the UK exchequer it's cost them over $1 billion. It's heading for 1.5, but it's at about 1.1, 1.2 billion now. So that's been a significant investment. I know when we looked at the Strawman, we felt that the break even was after year 10 on this. There is quite a significant upfront, and because the contribution levels build up quite slowly and the funds being managed build up very slowly, the fee levels are very low in the initial years, but the investment is all upfront. So one of the things we've outlined in the proposal today is a cost-benefit analysis of the different ways this can be delivered, because we feel there's quite a high state and a very high state cost with the way it's being proposed now. and we feel there was a lower state cost because the infrastructure was already there in the private market already for the strawman proposal. But this is a long-term game in either scenario in terms of low fee levels and an upfront investment.
Yeah. The international comparisons from the gender side. So I suppose the two big things that affect the pensions gender gap first are the salary gap. So any things that can be done in the salary gap are obviously good. And then secondly, it is those periods of unpaid leave. So when we look internationally at what has worked well, the UK, as I said previously, gives a credit into your pension scheme for times when you're on unpaid leave, which we don't do here for occupational schemes, and certainly there's nothing said in relation to what will happen with AE. The other mechanism that they have in the UK for schemes is they allow up to a certain percentage can be put in a tax efficient manner by a partner. So again, you're on periods of unpaid leave, but your partner is still in employment and you have the capacity to put in additional amounts, then the partner can put in a certain amount in a tax efficient manner into your pension scheme. The third issue is around maternity leave, and in particular unpaid maternity leave. So again, the ESRI in 2022 did a report in relation to maternity leave here in Ireland, and while the period of leave is very generous, the actual level at which maternity leave is paid by the state is quite low. And in the scenario where you aren't topped up on your maternity leave, then the gap obviously increases and gets bigger. So this is where the flexibility around the contribution model kind of becomes even more pertinent, because it would mean that you do need some capability, because your gap is going to be bigger, to be able to put additional contributions in. And I think the other big issue for auto-enrolment and occupational schemes is education, and education of young women in relation to the consequences of taking periods of unpaid leave, and that, you know, realistically you do, if you can afford it, start with a slightly higher contribution. And also, again, and I will talk from personal experience, when I went on maternity leave, I worked out, well, how much income am I going to be losing and how do I cover those costs? It didn't dawn on me ever to look at the impact that the pension was going to have on my pension scheme. It was only years later, when I started working in pensions, that I realised I had a gap in there and I needed to increase my contributions. So I do think both advice and information has to be critical in relation to this, so people are aware of the consequences of what happens when you take periods of unpaid leave.
Thank you, and can I thank you for your evidence here this morning and your detailed written submission. That concludes the first session this morning. I'd like to thank the representatives from Irish Life for your constructive and positive engagement with the committee, both this morning and, as I say, in your written submission. The committee will now adjourn for a couple of minutes. Thank you.